The wind carried the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the distant hum of sprinklers echoed across Willow Creek Drive. It was a slow-moving Sunday, the kind where time seemed to stretch out under the weight of cicada songs and children's laughter. Officer Dan Holloway rolled his cruiser quietly along the curb, his window halfway down, letting the familiar suburban air fill his lungs. Nothing ever happened here. That was both a blessing and a curse. Dan was a man built from years of habit, black coffee, early shifts, the quiet presence of his K-9 partner Max always sitting alert in the back seat. He had served this small Ohio town for over 2 decades, and though the uniform still fit, it carried weight now, the weight of loss, of things left unsaid, of years that couldn't be reclaimed. The call came through just after 4:30 p.m. A disturbance. Not urgent. Possible wildlife in the middle of the street. Not moving. Dan raised an eyebrow. Probably a raccoon or maybe one of the neighborhood's beloved feral cats. But as he turned the corner onto Willow Creek Drive, he hit the brakes and stared. There, in the middle of the asphalt, stood a full-grown buck. Majestic. Still, its antlers wide and striking, like a crown carved by time. Its coat shimmered in the sun, unmarred and golden brown. It was watching, not just looking, watching. Dan slowly stepped out of his cruiser. Max, stay. The dog let out a low rumble from his throat, but remained seated, ears perked, eyes locked on the deer. A few neighbors had already come out of their homes, gathering on their porches, phones in hand. Sarah Evans stood a few houses down, arms crossed, her daughter Lily peeking from behind her legs. The little girl's eyes were fixed on the deer, wide and still. 2 more cruisers pulled in. Officer Morales emerged with Max's brother-in-training, Bruno, a lean pit bull with a tendency to lunge first and ask questions never. Officer Fields followed, baton already unclipped from her belt. "What do we do?" Morales asked quietly, glancing at the gathering crowd. Dan raised a hand. "We wait." The deer remained frozen, but something shifted in the air. Not movement, exactly, but a tension, a silent communication. Dan could feel it deep in his chest, like the hush before a storm. His eyes met the animals, and for a moment he felt it. Familiarity. He didn't believe in signs or spirits or anything beyond what he could see and touch. But something about that deer, the way it looked at him, it reminded him of a face he couldn't place, like a dream he used to have but hadn't visited in years. Suddenly, Lily stepped forward. It was a moment so quiet, so simple, that no one reacted in time. The crowd murmured, Sarah shouted, but the little girl walked calmly, steadily, right into the space between the officers and the buck. Max barked loudly from the cruiser. Bruno pulled hard on his leash, his growl turning to a snarl. Dan moved forward. "Lily, back up." But the girl didn't flinch. The deer didn't either. She reached out a small, shaking hand, and Dan's world tilted on its axis. Because instead of bolting, instead of charging or panicking, the deer lowered its head, inch by inch, until its snout rested softly in the girl's open palm. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Morales took a step back. Lily whispered something no one could hear. The deer blinked slowly, then turned its head toward Dan. And that's when the memory hit him. The photo, old, water-stained, kept hidden in the back of a drawer for nearly 20 years. His daughter, Emily, no older than Lily, standing in a field behind their old farmhouse, feeding a fawn. She had named it Remus. It had vanished the same week Emily died. Dan staggered slightly. His hand gripped the side of the cruiser. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be. But when Lily turned to look at him, there was a strange softness in her eyes, as if she already knew. As the deer backed away slowly, stepping off the road and into the open yard beside it, Dan followed. His legs moved on instinct, his breath shallow. Max whimpered behind him, low and confused. Fields called out, but her voice sounded distant. Dan didn't understand what he was feeling. Not yet. But something inside him cracked. A quiet fracture in the thick wall he'd built around his grief. And whatever that deer was, it had come here for a reason. But that reason, the truth that had been buried for decades, was only beginning to stir. Dan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his recliner, the television flickering silently across the room, playing a nature documentary he wasn't watching. Max lay at his feet, ears twitching every now and then, still unsettled. Every time Dan closed his eyes, he saw the same image, the deer Remus, lowering its head into Lily's hand. And then that look, the way it turned and locked eyes with him, as if reaching into the very marrow of a memory he had tried so hard to forget. He hadn't thought about that field in years, the old family property up near Maple Hollow, long since sold to developers. But he could still picture it. Wide open space, golden grass swaying in the breeze, and little Emily running barefoot with wildflowers in her hands. She had always been gentle with animals, even as a toddler. And that summer, there was a young fawn that followed her around like a shadow. She had named him Remus. Dan had taken a few Polaroids, photos he never looked at again after the accident. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone and opened the gallery. Buried between pictures of sunsets, Max at the lake, and training drills with the K-9 unit was the scanned photo. Emily smiling, Remus beside her, almost nuzzling her shoulder. The same eyes, the same stance. It was impossible, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't just a deer. Something had brought it back. Across town, Sarah Evans sat beside Lily's bed, brushing strands of hair from her daughter's forehead. Lily was already asleep, but her expression was peaceful, almost glowing. Sarah still couldn't explain what happened. She had been ready to leap forward, to scream, to shield her daughter from a wild animal. But instead, she had frozen. Because in that moment, she had seen something ancient and kind in that deer's posture. Not danger, not confusion, something else. Sarah hadn't told anyone, not even the police, what Lily said to the deer. It had been soft, almost inaudible. Just 5 words. "You remember me, don't you?" Chills had run down Sarah's spine. She didn't know where her daughter had heard that name, or why the moment had felt so much bigger than a child and a wild animal. But something deep inside her said it wasn't over. And she was right, because just before sunrise, a knock came at her door. Not a loud one. Slow, steady. When she opened it, she found Officer Holloway on her porch. And in his eyes, for the first time, there was fear. Sarah didn't speak at first. She just stared at Officer Holloway, her hand still on the door handle, her other arm instinctively wrapped around her waist. Behind her, the hallway light cast a warm glow over the wooden floors, but the space between them on the porch felt cold and heavy. Dan looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, uniform slightly wrinkled, and his cap tucked under one arm like he didn't know what to do with it anymore. "I'm sorry to come by so early," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't sleep, and I need to talk to you about yesterday." Sarah nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Come in." The living room was small but tidy. A framed photo of Lily rested on the mantel above the fireplace. Dan's eyes caught it as he sat down. Her face, bright, gentle, reminded him even more of Emily. He cleared his throat, unsure of how to begin. "That deer," he said. "Lily called it by name. Remus. That was the name my daughter gave a fawn when she was little. Over 20 years ago." Sarah sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "She never told me that name before. I don't even know where she could have heard it." Dan nodded slowly. "There's more. I found an old photo last night. It's him. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear to you, it's the same deer. Same eyes, same antlers. There's something going on here, and I don't understand it." Sarah looked down. "Lily said something to him before you all saw her. She whispered, 'You remember me, don't you?' And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. She's always had feelings about things, dreams. She said the deer made her feel safe, like she'd known him forever." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Dan ran a hand down his face. "I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound out of line, but Is there any chance Lily and Emily could be? No, Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp, almost panicked. Emily died. I read about it years ago. Car accident. I remember. Dan swallowed hard. Yeah, she died. But Sarah, that deer disappeared the same week Emily did. And now he's standing in the middle of this town, 20 years later, staring at me like he's trying to tell me something. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Then maybe you should listen. Dan left Sarah's house just after 6 a.m., the rising sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk as he stepped back into the quiet morning. His cruiser sat parked beneath a street lamp, still glowing faintly in the dawn. Max was curled in the back seat, his ears twitching but his eyes closed. Dan stood for a moment before getting in, his thoughts swirling in a storm of memory and confusion. Everything he had buried, grief, guilt, the unanswered questions surrounding Emily's death, was clawing its way back to the surface. He hadn't planned to bring up Lily and Emily like that. It just spilled out. But Sarah's reaction only made things more complicated. She knew something. He could feel it in the way her voice cracked, the sudden fear in her eyes. People don't panic over coincidences unless they've been carrying a weight of their own. And now this dear Remus was back, standing calmly in the center of a suburban street, acting less like an animal and more like a messenger. Dan drove aimlessly for a while, passing the old town limits and into the outskirts where houses turned to farmland. The memories came hard out here. Dirt roads, the old family house with its creaking porch and broken barn. He hadn't been back since the year after Emily died. He told himself it was because the land had been sold, but the truth was he couldn't face the silence, or the ghost. When he pulled off the main road and into the gravel shoulder, he sat for several minutes before stepping out. The field was still there, mostly untouched, though overgrown now with weeds and thorns. The fence Emily used to climb was rotting, barely standing. Dan approached it slowly, heart pounding. He half expected to see the deer standing there, waiting. But the field was empty, and yet, the feeling was back. That strange, hollow presence. Like he was being watched, not with suspicion but with memory. Dan crouched down and ran his fingers through the tall grass. There, in the dirt, barely visible, was the soft imprint of hooves. Fresh ones, leading toward the far tree line. And beside them, a smaller set of footprints. Human, barefoot. Dan stood up abruptly, heart racing. No, he muttered under his breath. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But deep down, in a part of himself he rarely visited, he felt the sting of something undeniable. He wasn't just chasing a deer anymore. He was chasing a truth that someone, or something, had been trying to tell him for 2 decades. And now, the past was stepping out of the shadows. Mary Beth Keller hadn't worked a breaking story in over a decade. At 62, she mostly edited obituaries and wrote the occasional editorial for the Willow Gazette, a paper that barely held on in the digital age. But when she received a shaky video of a deer standing calmly in the middle of a police standoff, and then gently touching a little girl's hand, something stirred in her. Not just journalistic curiosity, something older, familiar. She didn't expect much when she began digging through the old police archives stored in the newspaper's basement. Most of the files were faded, dusty, and poorly organized. But as she thumbed through boxes marked Holloway, 2003, she found something that stopped her cold. A manila folder, unmarked, tucked beneath old press clippings. Inside was a photograph she had never seen before, one that made her breath catch. It was a photo of a little girl, Emily Holloway, standing in a field with a young deer. But something was off. The image looked recent. The colors were vivid, the quality too high for a 20-year-old Polaroid. She flipped it over. The back was blank, no date, no handwriting. And yet, she had covered the original story herself. She remembered the funeral, the grief in Officer Holloway's face. Emily had died in a car accident. Hadn't she? Mary Beth picked up the landline and dialed the police station. Officer Holloway wasn't on duty, but Officer Morales answered. When she asked about the deer, he chuckled nervously and said, "You mean the one that made my K9 hesitate?" "Yeah, "I've been thinking about it all day. There's something weird about that animal." She didn't press further. Not yet. Instead, she turned to her cluttered wall of old news articles, slowly pinning the photo next to a yellowed headline from 2003. "Tragedy on County Road 14. Officer's daughter dies in freak crash." Her fingers trembled slightly as she stepped back. Something didn't add up. Either the photo was a fake, or it was a window into something that defied every rule she thought she understood. That evening, she drove to the edge of town, where the fields met the woods. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that the photo was real and someone needed to know. She stood beside her car, staring into the trees. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, from the shadows, two eyes caught the last light of the day, watching her. She didn't run. She couldn't, because in those eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt since her childhood. Recognition. Walter Griggs hadn't spoken to anyone about the deer in over 40 years. Not because he didn't want to, but because no one ever believed him. In his younger days, he had been known around Willow Creek as the best tracker in 3 counties. He could read the forest like a map, hear a branch snap, and tell you if it was raccoon or coyote. But the one thing he never figured out was that buck. The one he saw in 1983. The one that shouldn't have been there. He was 26 then, hunting alone in the early fall. The air had been heavy, the woods too quiet, and when the deer appeared, tall, regal, and completely unafraid, Walter lowered his rifle. Not because he hesitated, because something inside him said don't. The deer stared at him, walked within 10 feet, then turned and vanished into the fog. When he returned to town and told the story, the laughter lasted weeks. So Walter learned to keep quiet, but he never forgot those eyes. Now at 76, Walter sat in his worn recliner, a shotgun resting by the door out of habit, not fear. He heard the local chatter about the deer in Willow Creek Drive. Normally he wouldn't give it a second thought, but when he saw the image on the local news, something in his gut turned. It was him, the same deer, not similar, the same one, same eyes, same antlers, same stillness. He pulled a small metal box from the back of his closet. Inside were a few faded photographs, a bullet casing, and a folded sheet of notebook paper. On that paper was a sketch he had made all those years ago of the deer's antlers. 8 points with a jagged split on the left. A rare pattern, too rare to be coincidence. As night fell, he decided to do what he hadn't done in decades. Walk into the woods, not to hunt, to see. With a flashlight and the sketch in his pocket, he followed the old trail past the creek. And after an hour of walking, he found them, hoof prints, fresh, leading deeper into the trees. His heart pounded like it used to when he was young. But this time, he wasn't afraid of the animal. He was afraid of what he might remember. As he reached the edge of the tree line, the wind shifted, and there it was, standing between the trees as still as ever. Watching, Walter stared back, breath caught in his chest. "You're real," he whispered. But deep down he knew. This deer wasn't just real. He had come back for something Walter had forgotten long ago. Dan returned to the station the next morning, running on caffeine and instinct. His mind was a mess of tangled timelines and faces. Emily, Lily, the deer, Sarah. None of it made sense, yet all of it felt connected. He didn't believe in magic. He didn't believe in ghosts. But he was starting to believe in memory, how it hides, how it waits, how it comes back when you least expect it. In the records room, dust hung in the air like smoke. Most officers avoided the place, but Dan had always found comfort in the quiet hum of paper and time. He pulled out a box marked Unsolved 1980s, hoping for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. It didn't take long. A ledger, handwritten in faded ink, caught his eye. Tucked inside, a report from 1983, filed by a young patrolman. A disturbance near the woods. The complainant's name jumped out at him. Walter Griggs. The report was brief. Saw a large deer. Behavior unusual. Not aggressive. Unafraid. Dan exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was the first real thread tying the past to the present. He photocopied the report and tucked it into his jacket. As he turned to leave, he noticed another file, unmarked, wedged between old folders. Inside were photos. Not crime scene photos, but ones clearly taken with intention. All of them showed children, and the same deer always in the background, watching. One of the photos was dated 1961. Another, 1975. And the final one, Dan's heart dropped, was from 2003. Emily, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, with the deer standing just beyond her. It wasn't just his story. This deer had appeared in the lives of children across generations. Always watching, always returning. Dan felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. Back in her home, Sarah sat at the kitchen table while Lily colored quietly beside her. The air in the house had changed. Heavier. Sarah had tried to pretend everything was fine, that yesterday's events could be rationalized. But the way Lily had been acting since, it was different. She spoke in soft riddles, half in dreams. She drew pictures of places they'd never been. Fields, cabins, faces that looked familiar but weren't hers. And in every drawing, the deer. Dan knocked at the door just before noon, holding the photo in his hand. When Sarah opened it, he didn't say a word. He just handed it to her. She looked down at the image of Emily and Remus. Her eyes welled up. She didn't ask how he had it. She just looked back at him and whispered, "I think it's time we told her the truth." Lily sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the late afternoon light spilling in through the window and casting golden shapes across the walls. Her coloring book lay forgotten beside her. Instead, she was focused on a small wooden box she had found in the back of Sarah's closet. It was old, worn smooth at the edges, and locked, but she had seen it before. In a dream, maybe, or something like a memory. Downstairs, Dan and Sarah spoke in hushed tones. He had questions. She had confessions. Sarah explained how Lily had always been different. Sensitive, sometimes eerily perceptive. There were moments as a baby when she would stare into empty corners and smile. Times when she spoke names that Sarah had never mentioned out loud. Names like Emily. She had chalked it up to coincidence, imagination. But now, she wasn't so sure. Sarah finally admitted the truth. She had known Dan's daughter. Briefly, they had lived in the same neighborhood as teenagers, went to the same summer camp one year. Emily had been kind to her in a way most girls weren't. They weren't close, but Sarah had never forgotten her. When she learned about Emily's accident years later, something inside her ached in a way she couldn't explain. And then Lily was born, and things started happening. "She draws her face," Sarah said softly, sliding a worn page from under a stack of others. A child's drawing, crude but unmistakable. The same smile, the same long brown hair. "Emily. She says her name without me ever telling her. I thought maybe she saw a picture once, or heard me say something by accident. But now I think it's more than that." Dan listened in silence, hands folded, eyes heavy. The rational part of his brain screamed to stop this, to step away from the emotion, the fog. But something deeper in him, older, quieter, believed. Or maybe it just wanted to believe. Upstairs, Lily finally opened the box. It clicked open easily now, as if it had never truly been locked. Inside was a faded note, a pressed wildflower, and a black and white photo of a young girl holding a deer by the neck like an old friend. Lily traced the edges of the photo with her small fingers and whispered, "I told you I'd find you again." That night, she slipped outside without a sound. The grass was cool beneath her feet as she crossed the yard, eyes fixed on the woods. From the shadows, two eyes blinked slowly, waiting. Not like an animal, like someone who remembered. And this time, she didn't stop walking. The woods behind Willow Creek had always held a quiet presence. Dense enough to get lost, close enough to never feel truly wild. But that night, as Dan pushed through the underbrush with a flashlight in hand and Max pacing nervously beside him, the forest felt ancient. The air was colder, thicker. Every sound, every snapped twig, every rustle in the leaves, seemed amplified by something invisible and watching. Sarah had found Lily's bed empty just after midnight. The window was open, her shoes still by the door. Dan was the first call she made, and he didn't hesitate. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment. Feared it, maybe, but knew it would come. He followed Lily's trail into the trees, Max staying close, strangely quiet. The dog's usual intensity had been replaced by something almost respectful, like he too understood what they were approaching. The trail led them to a clearing Dan hadn't seen in years. Not since he was a boy. Back then, it had been the site of a cabin, long since collapsed, where the town's founders once lived. Now it was just a circle of grass and silence, bathed in moonlight. And in the center of that clearing stood Lily, barefoot, her hair gently moving in the breeze, and beside her, Remus. Dan froze. The deer stood taller than he remembered, antlers stretched wide like branches. But it wasn't fear that filled him, it was recognition. Lily turned to him slowly, her voice calm, almost distant. "I knew you'd come. Lily," he said gently, stepping forward. "We need to go home." She shook her head. "This is home. It's where she waited." Before Dan could ask what she meant, Lily reached into the folds of her nightgown and pulled out the photo from the box. The one of the girl and the deer. She held it out to him. "This is me," she said softly. "From before." Dan took the photo with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the image, then looked at Lily again. The slope of her nose, the tilt of her smile. It was impossible but undeniable. And in that moment, something in him broke wide open. The grief he'd buried for years rushed to the surface. Not to drown him, but to free him. From the trees, another figure emerged. Walter. Old, slow, steady. He had followed a different path, but it led to the same truth. He looked at Dan, then at Remus, and said quietly, "We don't lose them. Not really. They just wait. Until we're ready to see them again." Morning broke slowly through the trees, painting the clearing in soft gold. The forest no longer felt heavy. It felt like it was breathing, alive in a way Dan hadn't felt since he was a child. Lily sat beside Remus, her small hand resting gently against his fur. The deer stood perfectly still, eyes half closed, as if the weight of decades had finally been lifted. Dan dropped to one knee, overwhelmed, not just by what he was seeing, but by what he was finally understanding. All these years, he thought healing meant forgetting. That to move on, he had to lock the memories away. But here, in this silent space between the living and the lost, he saw it clearly. Memory wasn't a prison. It was a bridge. And Lily, she had walked across it without fear. Sarah arrived minutes later, breathless and pale, rushing through the trees until she saw her daughter safe. Relief washed over her, but what she saw in Dan's face stopped her cold. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't confused. He looked peaceful, changed. Lily stood and walked to her mother, placing something in her hand. It was the pressed wildflower from the box. Sarah hadn't seen it in years, not since before Lily was born. Walter stayed back, leaning against a tree, his old eyes watching it all unfold. "Some things," he said softly to no one in particular, "aren't meant to be explained, only witnessed." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods like he had always belonged there. Remus took one final step toward Dan and lowered his head. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a thank you. Then, without sound or struggle, he turned and slipped into the forest, fading into the light like a shadow at sunrise. And just like that, he was gone. In the weeks that followed, Dan returned to the clearing often, not to search, but to remember. Lily would sometimes come with him, holding his hand, her laughter echoing through the trees like it had always belonged there. And though the deer never returned, its presence never left. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive in answers, but in understanding, in connection, in the quiet moments when the past stands beside the present, and you realize they were never separate at all. In those woods, beneath the same sky, something lost had been returned. Not as it was, but as it was meant to be. And for the first time in over 20 years, Dan Holloway smiled without sorrow.